city planning and architecture is the most important art. I'm not an architect, but I can see that because it fades behind people's perception. It pre-models the way that people understand who they are, what's their relationship to each other, what's inside, what's outside, what is above, what is below. Just basic orientation in your life is based on city planning and an architecture. And there's a deep alienation in modern living that comes from living in these horrible places and these abstracted spaces with no center and no community and no sense of relationships. That's a call for people to take it seriously, for people who are studying architecture, that you're doing the most important thing. It's hard right now. It's hard to do it, but that is the most important thing to be done.
This is Jonathan Pedro. Welcome to the Symbolic World.
Rapunzel and the Evil Witch is officially available right now. It is not in pre-sale. It is not a pre-order. It is in the warehouse. You can just go to rapunzelbook.com and you get the book. We have a new distribution system, which has just been amazing. People are getting their books in a few days. All the pre-sale and pre-order books have already been shipped. People already have them. And so this is the third book where a lot of the symbolism is going to come out. It's our celebratory tone, the third book in the series of the Tales for Once and Ever, illustrated by Heather Pollington. This is where the symbolism is going to start to show, where the characters are going to repeat. So I'm particularly excited about this book and the continuation of this series. And so go to rapunzelbook.com now, and you can just get the book, get it in a few days. So thanks, everyone. So hello, everyone. I am here with my friend Andrew Gould and with Michael Diamant. We are going to talk about urban planning, about architecture, traditional architecture, about all the projects that are happening. Michael is an advocate for traditional architecture and for proper urban planning. And as many of you know, Andrew is an architect. He's been on my channel a few times. He is a long-standing friend of mine. We started the Orthodox Art Journal now in 2012 together, and he is one of the biggest reasons why I actually was able to start icon carving. So I have a great debt of friendship and to him. And so, Michael, thanks for doing this. And maybe you can start by telling us a bit what you do. It's a very odd thing to think of a kind of architecture advocacy. So maybe you can explain a little bit what it is that you do.
Thank you very much for having me on this podcast. Well, some of the concepts may be alien to an American audience, because I think in the US, you do what you want. If you want to build a Gothic cathedral, you build a Gothic cathedral. You're much more free in your mind in the US than we are in Europe. We're always constrained by our municipalities have much stronger to say what we are allowed to build, and also socially what we are allowed to do. So it's a bit different. So what I've been doing the last 14 years is social media advocacy for new traditional architecture. It began in my native country, Sweden, but now it has spread to all over Europe. There is an architecture uprising in every European country. There is in Turkey, there is in Lebanon, there is in Israel. I was in contact actually with a woman in Syria, but now everything has faded away there. There is an uprising in India, and I'm also in contact with a professor at Hong Kong University that want to start something similar in China. But of course, they can't call something uprising on the Chinese social media. Basically, what the advocacy and what the uprising movement is about is to make ordinary people, that is non-architects, realize that we can build beautiful today. Most people, an overwhelming majority, think that there is some kind of rational reason why we build so ugly today. They think it must be because of costs or because if you want high standard of living, it must be ugly. And that is totally false. So when you dig down into this, you realize that everything is about ideology. And most architects, not Andrew, of course, are what we would call modernists. And their ideal, actually, I would say almost is to build ugly, because like modernist artists, they feel special if everyone hates what they're doing. So we do advocacy, and we make ordinary people very successfully in Sweden, in Norway, now Germany, Netherlands also very much, realize that we can build beautiful if we want. It's a choice. It's not a necessity to build things ugly. We can build beautiful, and we also should build beautiful, because all of the, of course, you must have all kind of practical reasons today why promote beauty. You can't just say, it's for good, it's for a higher ideal. You must promote it as, it's good for health, it's good for well-being, it reduces stress. So of course we talk a lot about that, but also the democratic argument. If people want it, then we should build it.
Mm-hmm.
So as said, this has been very successful in my native Scandinavia, and it's spread to many other European countries. And now in the public discourse in Sweden, most people know that all the ugliness that they see in the built environment is built on purpose, because the architects wanted to build this way. And that's a success, because then you have a discussion, a proper discussion about our built environment.
Yeah, well, I guess that I'll be the devil's advocate for a little, because obviously I don't think this, but maybe Andrew, you can pipe in on this as well, which is, of course, the argument is that traditional beauty is something, either it's arbitrary or it's oppressive, right? It's either arbitrary or it's an image of the old world, of hierarchies, of the days when we had kings and aristocracies, and that modern architecture is functional, but it's also democratic in the sense that it's equalizing. It has this kind of this aesthetic of equalizing things. And so how do you answer to those arguments?
Yes, that's the lie they sell. Oh, sorry.
Yes. Well, I was going to say that some of those things are lies and some of them are true. The equalizing argument, I think, is largely true. The communist governments liked building, identical housing blocks with identical apartments in an international modern style, not just because it was cheap and easy to build such repetitive buildings, but also ideologically they liked that it was equalizing.
It's reductive architecture.
Yes. But of course, I mean, that kind of socialist ideology is mostly out of favor nowadays. The idea that classical architecture, for instance, specifically references, the time of, plantation slaveholding, or, old regime France, or whatever your sort of political enemy might be. That doesn't really hold water, because traditional classical architecture was basically all architecture until the mid-20th century. It existed in every type of governmental and political system. Places like the Athens Republic or the Dutch Republic used classical architecture, the same as, autocratic kingdoms used it. The British Empire used classical architecture after it freed slavery, just as Americans used it before freeing slaves. I mean, it does not correlate to politics that way. It doesn't actually even correlate very well to sort of, communist ideology. Yes, communists justified their ugly architecture because it was equalizing, but Americans were building the very same ugly equalizing housing blocks in American cities at the same time, and they justified it because it was, of its time and of the nuclear age and looked like the future. We justified it by claiming it was great and modern, and they justified it by claiming it was, equalizing and humble, and, appropriate to the working man. But
it's a nonsense argument.
It's the same stuff. Yeah.
It is a nonsense argument, and there is a reason why they use this and talk about all this nonsense. It's because they don't want to talk about architecture. They always want to talk politics, because as long as they talk politics, and if you swallow that bait, then they don't need to talk about architecture. But also, if you put classical architecture, vernacular architecture, and modernist architecture, and just would compare their merits, okay, which one is more climate friendly? Okay, then classical architecture wins. Which one is more humane? Classical architecture wins. On every metric, classical architecture would win. That's why they never ever want to talk architecture, and they would go instantly on politics and talk all this nonsense, because the only way they can win. As soon as they cannot talk politics, they lose. And that's why I have, okay, I use maybe offensive terms here, but I got something called a race card in these discussions. I'm half Jewish. My mother was born in a refugee camp in the Soviet Union. Her parents were Polish Jews. So they can't call me a Nazi, because they advocate the classical architecture. And as soon as they can't do that, they're just dumbfounded. Then everything falls. So everything is based on being able to label people and not talk about architecture.
Yeah. I just watched the Brutalist movie, which it was unbearable. I really did not like watching it, I have to be honest with you. And they have this crazy thing at the end, right, where the niece of the architect announces that the secret, like, motivation or reason behind the architecture was basically to recall the Holocaust and to recall the gas chambers. And I was like, what kind of insane thing is this? It's like, are you promoting it this way? Are you promoting it in the sense like, so now you want us all to live in the gas chambers? Is that what you're trying to suggest? It was nuts. Like, it was a wild argument. I mean, I don't know how is that what modernism ends up being, like this nihilistic desire for us to live in inhumane spaces to remind us of our own horror or to remind us of our own death or something?
But it's with beautiful things, you don't need many words to describe it. Beauty is instantly. If I look at one of Andrew's works, you don't need to know anything about architecture. You don't need to know anything about symbolism. If you do, you can of course read a lot of things, but you can appreciate it instantly. Just being an ordinary layman, never ever open a book about architecture. With all this modernist type of architecture, because it's so empty, just like modernist art, you need to invent a story. So what you call it? They are snake oil salesmen. I think that's the word you're using. They have to invent all this story, and they are of course very narcissistic because they sell these stories, and also they don't. How do you say? They don't live like they preach. They made a survey. That is probably very true in the US. They made a survey. The Union of Swedish Architects made a survey where Swedish architects live. And overwhelmingly, they live in classical architecture. And they also work in classical buildings. And then they make modernist for everyone else. And it's probably the same. If you would look up where all these modernist architects live, you would see the same pattern.
And so tell us a bit about also city planning, because we tend to think about architecture at the outset because that's our most immediate reference. You see a building, you kind of see the but it seems, what's exciting about what you're doing, and also what you've been doing, for decades, is you're not just involved in building, but also thinking about the environment, thinking about city planning as an extension of the architectural idea. So maybe, Michael, if you want to start us on that, and then Andrew, I'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah. Well, first of all, when building cities, we're talking about apartments mostly, but townhouses, of course, as well. Apartment living is not very attractive in the Anglo world, as I understood it. And the reason for this, and I may be totally wrong, this is just my outside perspective, is because you traditionally, except for a few places, maybe in California, you don't have what you call it courtyard urbanism. You have a green space in the middle, and the building, envelops it. So you don't get greenery. You just have massive blocks. So that makes that you get very uneven density in the US. You either get, townhouses or villas or high-rises. You don't get gentle density like 3 to 6 story buildings that are mixed use and that are so attractive to live in that even upper middle class want to live in them, like in Europe. I would say continental Europe then. So that's a problem. But you have now, there is a woman in Chicago that does really, really good. You should have her as a guest sometime. Really good advocacy for courtyard urbanism in the US, just because I think, and she thinks as well, it's the only functional way to make it more attractive for middle-class people in the United States, in the Anglo world, to live in apartment buildings. Because if you have a family, of course you want the kids to have some kind of greenery. And in the courtyard, you have protected private greenery. So yeah.
Yeah, and then you also have windows on both sides of the apartment, which is one of the problems of apartment living. Yeah.
You have windows on
what
both
about
sides.
like the spatial argument? Because there's people, I guess, will make an economic argument and say that it's more cost effective to build a high rise or to build condos that take up all that space, because there's the density argument. Our city has agreed to a certain density, for environmental reason and for all these reasons. So because of it, they're kind of in trouble. Like they have to build these things that have more density in order to justify their requirements, I guess.
That's the good thing with city planning, that it can be very political. I don't know how it works in the US, but in Sweden, the politicians have the last word. So we can choose the exact amount of density that we want. And there is no goal of having maximum density. What you want is attractive and livable density. You want gentle density. You don't want tower blocks with hundreds of people that live like ants and no one knows everyone. You want create community spaces, and the courtyard urbanism is very much, you have not too much density and not too little density. And you also have an enclosed space where you meet your neighbors. Because, in this closed space, the courtyard, there it's a closed space. So it's not an open space for the public. Everyone in the courtyard is either people that live around the courtyard, in the buildings around the courtyard, or their friends. So there you have a lot of social activities. You have barbecues, birthday celebrations and such. And the balconies are centered towards the courtyard, not towards the street. So people sit on their balconies towards. You also get a lot of watchful eyes.
Yeah.
There you have architecture of community. You create community by having this type of a fixed amount of people, not too many, not too few, and you meet the same people every day. You don't need to be your friends, but you see them enough so it becomes, natural to have conversations and such.
You also get the highest density with mid-rise development. Curiously, urban cores that have high-rise, like skyscraper building heights, they actually don't get more density for that because they need a lot of space between those skyscrapers. They need very wide roads for all the traffic and emergency vehicles that have to access them. They need a lot of space for all the scaffolding and so forth to build them. So like when New York City went from mid-rise development in the 19th century to skyscraper development in the 20th century, it did not actually gain any density for that. In fact, you usually lose density when you see that transition because everything's going to office space and to, giant penthouse apartments for the super rich, oligarch apartments that nobody really lives in, that are just investment property, and regular people can't even afford to live downtown and wouldn't really want to because it becomes an inhospitable, windswept place. So it's true that mid-rise urban cores have the highest living density, but even that's higher than we really need. In America, most new development is not urban at all. It's suburban sprawl, which is very low density single family houses, or if it's apartment buildings, it's still low density because they have huge parking lots in between them. I was lucky enough to grow up in one of the few American cities that has courtyard apartments. Brookline, Massachusetts. It's a beautiful Victorian garden suburb town of Boston that's a mixture of Victorian single-family houses, attached townhouses, and courtyard apartment buildings that were typically 3 or 4 stories tall. And everybody of every class, back then lived all mixed together in this town. Everybody could walk to corner stores. It was kind of an urban paradise, and there was very little traffic because of it. And it was very high density. So really the fight here is increasing density from suburban density to sort of traditional urban mixed-use density. In America, we have loads of land. There's no need for people to be building, Manhattan kind of urban core density to house our population. Frankly, in Europe, there's not either, because Europe doesn't even have a replacement birth rate.
No, exactly.
There's not a need for new housing in Europe, except insofar as there's, sort of runaway immigration and need to house, foreigners. That's a political problem of its own creation, right there.
Exactly.
And so it's so difficult because obviously I'm very convinced by your argument. And so what is driving the madness? Like, what is driving? Because one of the things that I get the sense, because it's not just about having courtyard building, for example. Like, one of the problems of urban sprawl, of suburban sprawl especially, is the kind of specialization of space where you have highways, and then highways connect huge shopping centers to like huge living areas, and there's this kind of disintegration of space, right? People take their car, they drive 45 minutes to work, then they drive 45 minutes home, and there's all this kind of fragmentation. Is there a way to discuss, because Andrew, you were involved in the building of Ion, which was a very kind of experimental new urbanist project near Charleston, where they tried to recreate this sense of, like a little market with housing and a few churches, this sense of a center, of a city center, and it's been very successful. Like, obviously it made the prices of those buildings like just skyrocket. And so, is it possible to recapture that today? There is the 5-minute city, like there's that, people are talking about that. So maybe I'd like to hear your opinions on the basic problem of urban planning right now.
Well, modernist ideology. So, sorry, now it's
Go ahead, Mike. You can start and then Andrew can continue.
Well, yeah. Well, I think that's mostly true, Michael. I mean, in America, I would say, it's been proven that new urbanist developments are politically popular, good for real estate value, good for the developer's bottom line. The things that stand in the way of it, bad zoning, these kinds of developments are typically in suburbs of older cities, and suburbs tend to have low density zoning, and they tend to still be sort of holding on to this fear from the 1960s that high density means poor people and chaos, and it still tends to be old people who are sitting on town councils in charge of zoning, and they just they like their ranch house on a 3-acre lot, and they just can't picture why anyone would want to live in a high-density mixed-use kind of neighborhood, because they remember when they, left that kind of neighborhood in 1965. Yeah, so that's a big part of the problem, is outdated zoning. Another big part of the problem is just regulatory stuff, rules from highway departments, traffic departments, fire departments, rules that require really wide roads, really easy vehicular access, really high parking to dwelling unit ratios. These bad regulations make it really difficult to do urban density or urban type walkable design. And then another big hindrance is a talent deficit among the designers. There's not that many classical architects or traditionalist urban planners or traditionalist traffic engineers to go around. So a developer who wants to build something that looks like a traditional town may have a really hard time finding local consultants who have the skills or the knowledge to do that. They might find people who say they can do it, but the results are often very poor, because they're all people who are trained at modernistic design schools. That's been my observation.
What do you think, Michael?
I completely agree with everything he says, because we are having that problem now in Sweden, where I live. So now we have a political will for more traditional projects. The problem is that we have in a country of 10 million, we have 5 classical architects. So we really, they can't do a lot of work. So it is, sorry for butchering English, but I think you call it Oxham's razor. If you deep dive in, everything's about the ideology that they teach at school. In architecture schools, most architecture schools, 99% of all architecture schools, they will not teach anything about classical tradition, classical city planning, classical architecture. They will label it some kind of history lesson, but it's not. So all the things that we appreciate about the classical city and the classical city planning, or the cities that we visit, when you're tourist in Savannah or in Charleston, it's not by accident that they are so good. Everything is very well planned. So you need to know these things to be able to do them. And because an overwhelming majority of all architects are not educated in this, they are even ideologically against to learn. They have been ideologically conditioned to never look to the past, because the past was, we already talked about it, classicist, racist, slavery, they will label it in our way. And if something is, labeled that way, it makes people less curious to open a book, because why should I learn from these racist, slavery owning, etc., etc. So everything starts and begins at architecture school, because all these regulations that are bad, of course they are very bad, but they are not written in stone. If all architects were educated classical, you could have meaningful lobbying to politicians and we could change the regulations. But I would say that most architects don't know what regulations that should be changed to make good city planning. So that's the basic problem. So you will always come back to that, people want to blame capitalism or capitalism built, 100 years ago, the world was more capitalistic and it built marvelous cities. So that hasn't changed. The only thing that changed is the architecture profession. That changed. And then suddenly the whole world became ugly.
I've had so many, it's so weird. Like I've had so many architects come up to me at conferences, at different speaking events. They come up to me in this kind of spirit of desperation, as if they feel lost. They have this desire to connect with ancient wisdom, but they feel as if there's no room for them, and that there's no, like you said, there's even a difficulty in learning how to do it. Like it's, even finding the skills is difficult. And so it feels like the people are there, right? That the people who desire to learn these skills exist, and that they feel disconnected and alone. And so is there an option for them? Like, is there a place that they can go? Is there groups that they can contact so that they can at least form networks, in order to have some kind of strength?
Yes, they can. First of all, there's never been more talent in the world than there is today. The problem is that all this talent is directed wrongly. So we probably have, at least 1 million potential Michelangelos in the world, but none of them are directed to do art or architecture. They probably do computer game graphics or something, So it's we have to have talent. We have talent, the number of people in the world that have access to, higher education is very, very large today compared to 100 years ago, but they are just directed wrong. There are a few places in the US. You have Notre Dame University where you can, and now I think there is at least 4 or 5 colleges where you can study to become a classical architect. And there's, of course, social media and the internet. So there's a lot of, different groups on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Reddit. So every political spectrum, what you prefer then. And you can find like-minded. Of course, there is an English-speaking Architecture Uprising, but there is no specific US Architecture Uprising. There is a small Canadian uprising, but with the US, it's hard to begin because the US is a continent. You would need, as with Europe, you would need one for each and every state, just for people to connect with like-minded. And there you find each other, and there you hear, what options there are. I know in Europe, I get a lot of students reach out to me, and I direct them to the study options that there are, the summer schools. Now you can do a master and a doctor's degree in classical architecture in Trondheim's University in Norway. And I think almost every European country now has a summer school. And they're also talking now about creating a permanent classical architecture education in Paris. So there are things going on now, but most important is that you just connect with like-minded, because then you do self-study. A lot of you can study yourself, and then of course you can take contacts with people like Andrew, and you can have an exchange.
Yeah.
What books can I read? Where can I learn the symbols? How can I learn the craftsmanship? What studios are that work with these kind of things?
Andrew, you're in the U.S. You've seen. I mean, it seems like there is some change. In theory, Trump was supposed to pass this classical architecture bill for at least federal buildings. And so it feels like there's at least a little bit of wind in the sails. Maybe you can tell us what you see.
Yes, there is. My experience is that outside of academia, outside the universities, the modernist ideology no longer has very much of a hold on architecture. Most architects that I have interacted with who are working on commercial projects around the US, most of them are pretty willing to do classical architecture in theory. They just don't really know how to do it well. Most developers would prefer to do it in theory, but they know from experience that it doesn't usually come out very well, and that it's kind of complicated finding all the right people to get it done well. And so there's a lot of sort of, path of least resistance inertia that's perpetuating modernism. My personal feeling is that a really big problem is that because we've had 100 years now where architecture schooling is treated as a technical scientific field akin to engineering, it's ended up being a field in which people with a sort of engineer's mindset, those are the people who are attracted to the field, those are the people who excel in architecture jobs. Because architecture is not a very artistic discipline for the most part now. It's mostly a matter of understanding immensely complicated building codes, understanding immensely complicated mechanical systems, dealing with banks, dealing with money, dealing with business stuff, keeping on schedule. It's all, the kind of guys who have, Masters of Business Administration degrees actually do pretty well in the architecture field. They know how to keep, money correctly categorized. They know how to keep things flowing. They know how to communicate with the lawyers. And that's mostly what architects do. And so I often interact with architecture firms. Sometimes they're firms that have been asked to collaborate with me on projects where the developer would like a more classical result in the project. And often the guys in these firms, they've really gotten over the ideology stuff. They're totally on board with new urbanism and, new classicism in theory, but they have no artistic skills with which to do it. They might stick some classical columns on their building, but they just don't. They don't have the eyes to see that their work just is not right. And when I tell them it's not right, here's how you make it right, they get kind of defensive because they think classical architecture should be like a couple of rules you follow, like following the building code. But it's not. It's art, and art can be partially reduced to rules, but not entirely. And guys who just don't have an artistic temperament aren't going to be able to do it. So yeah, we really need to find a way. A long-term solution to this is going to involve finding a way to get people with artistic temperaments into architecture. And it's not going to be by making them, learn all the building codes and deal with all the bureaucracy, because people of an artistic temperament don't do well with that. It's going to have to be a system where, there's some people in charge of the artistic part of architecture and other people in charge of the technical part, and figure out a way for those types of people to collaborate productively.
Yeah, there are two. I have two things that pop up in my mind when listening to you. One is that most of the architecture that we see is just horrible. Like it's just boring and horrible and then what they seem to exist is a few flagship, like wild projects that always kind of push towards this futuristic image of the skyscraper or this really deconstructed image of the building. And those are the architecture projects that get the attention, right? So, Guggenheim Bilbao and all of these, or the Shard, or all of these kind of wild, crazy projects that get the attention. So those look to people, that's what creativity looks like, right? That's creative. That's the artistic part. Like, look at all this really creative architecture. That's one. And the other problem is, like you said, that most of the buildings that try to look classical today, they look like caricatures, and it's hard because sometimes you go into these neighborhoods of mansions, right? These mansion neighborhoods, and although the buildings are trying to look like classical, they're just hard to look at because they look like a joke. They look like someone took a classical building and made a joke with it, and this is millions of dollars in these buildings. So I don't know what you think about those problems, let's say.
Well, there are two separate problems. The buildings with strange shapes, they are a result of the modernist mindset, because it began with pure rational buildings, the 60s buildings, the 70s building, the one that you see in Washington, the brutalist one that people hate. But now it mutated to narcissism. So the only thing that matters, that is promoted in architecture education and among modernist architects, is novelty. It doesn't matter if the building is good, it doesn't matter if people like it doesn't matter if it's beautiful, it doesn't matter if it's functional. The only thing is novelty. So how to create this novelty? They use computer programs because they can instantly calculate so the building, won't fall down, and then they can create all these strange shapes. And then they win prizes because no one has ever done this before. So that's the crazy buildings when architects get a free hand. It's based on this insane ideology. The boring ones, the very boring boxes, they are also because of modernism. They are because, when developers in every field, when you profit maximize, you do it in two ways. One is to cut costs. The other is to add a value that people are ready to pay more for. If we take, Apple smartphones, they cost $100 to produce and people pay $1,000 or $1,500 for it because it has a value that people are ready to pay more for. In architecture, very few people are ready to pay more for modernist architecture. So the only way for developers to profit maximize is to cut costs. Why the Architecture Uprising we can show so many projects is because those developers that try classical architects, here in Sweden, in Germany, in France, everywhere, they notice, it's profit maximizing to build this way. Maybe we can cut cost, but also we add, 5% cost, then we can sell it for 15% more. So the way to profit maximize is different in the classical market and the modernist market. But with that said, you can make a very cheap classical building that's very beautiful, because the classical is not in the materials, it's not in the ornament, it's in the facade division. You have this. If I should explain classical beauty, and Andrew will probably be angry at me here. Now it's from an outside, non-architect view. So is it basically you have this three-part facade division of almost every classical building. So you have a base with a baseline, then you have a midsection, and then you have a roof section. And this three-part division is like the human body. If you go out and look at even if you can look at a classical skyscraper in New York, and they will have the same division, of the building. So the base is it's the highest part, because psychologically it makes us feel safe. Then you have the midsection, and the roof section is the smallest part. So then instantly our brain can read this building and understand this building. And because the baseline is the highest line, then it feels that the building is stable. It will not fall upon us. So our minds relax of it. The second part of classical beauty is how you place the windows. So you don't have one set of windows, one row of windows like you see on this 60s building, or like random like you see now on more contemporary buildings. You have, symmetry pairs. You have part symmetries. So you have many different symmetries on the facade. So what you get is a building that is instantly readable for our mind. So you relax. At the same time, it's gentle stimulation with these part symmetries. Not one symmetry on the facade, but part symmetries. So here you have if I would say the key for why we find classical architecture beautiful, if you just remove all symbols or ornament, all materials, it would be the readability and the gentle stimulation.
Yeah, the proportions is what you seem to.
Proportions as well, yeah.
And you see that, like, I was looking at your Twitter feed, Michael, and it was interesting because you had several projects. Because when we think of classical architecture, obviously, like you said, we think of ornament, we think of columns with, but you had several buildings that didn't look antique and finished. Like they had a simple, not modern, but like a simple finish. But because of the proportionality, they still read, and because of the relationship between symmetry and variation, where you have enough variation but you also have a sense of symmetry, then you feel, like you said, that you have something that's both relaxing but interesting at the same time, that doesn't threaten you, like it looks like the pieces of the building are attacking you, but is also like it has this kind of solid. Andrew, do you want to comment on this? And also, I still need to comment on the McMansion problem, like this kind of fake classicism that everybody.
Well, it's true that bad classicism is even worse than modernism in most cases, because classical architecture does have traditional order to it. Like a classical building is very recognizable how all of its elements are ordered in relation to one another. They are partially anthropomorphic. They're also fractal, like the proportioning rules that apply to the whole building tend to apply to the individual parts of a building. The whole building has a base, middle, and top, but an individual column also has a base, middle, and top. An individual window has a sill at the bottom and a projecting head molding at the top. So every part of the building is like the whole, and that kind of order, which mirrors the sort of order that we see in natural forms, in trees or mountains or living things. That kind of order is mostly what makes classical buildings so beautiful, but it also means that a disordered classical building is grotesque looking. It's like a creature with two heads, or something, or something with one arm chopped off, or something, So
right. I think what you said is exactly right. And now that I can picture these horrible McMansions in my mind, is that one of the things that happens is that they take the trapping. So there'll be like molding, and there'll be all of this architectural exteriority, but the proportions are wrong. And so you have this thing with the wrong proportions that looks completely out of scale. And the windows are completely wild. Like the lady was just like, I just want a window there. I don't care what it does to the building. And then in the end, it looks like this, like someone with too much makeup on, something like that.
Yeah, it could. I mean, the most common mistake with ignorant classical architecture is that the columns are too skinny for what they're holding up. Like you've got a little column with a capital, and then there's this big fat beam or this big fat pediment on top of them. And then it looks like somebody wearing a big clown head, or somebody with a head too big for the body. Or you see like some missing element to the moldings. You'll have like the column, and then you'll have like the cornice, but there's no entablature in between, so it looks like somebody with no neck. It's a grotesque effect. The nice thing about modernist architecture is in its lack of order, in its total abstraction, it is kind of anything goes. The building might not have anything appealing about it, but it might not have anything grotesque about it either, because it just kind of, it looks unrelatable. You don't really have any emotional reaction to it in many cases.
And that's the reductive part of it. When modernism has spread all around the world, it reduces everyone to a global consumer. There's no difference between a skyscraper in Stockholm or one in Bangkok or one in Seattle.
Yeah.
No difference at all. You can't see where it is. There's no cultural expression, and it's not even adapted to the climate. So this is also something that's, very important. What classical architecture does right is that it's adapted to the local climate, and there are a million small details that classical architecture found depending on where the building is built. Does it rain much? Does the rain come by wind sideways, or does it come upward? You see all kind of these smart solutions that are in different places. And when you have an illiterate architect that does this classical, you get a lot of problems, as you have with modernist architecture, because it's not adapted for climate, and then you get all kind of things that you didn't know would happen because you never learned, about the tradition. I can give you a very good example. I live in Sweden where it rains and snows a lot, yet our modernist architects build flat roofs. So we get building leakage. We get leakage, of water because, it creates a pool on top of the floor. For thousands of years we build with broken roofs, but suddenly we should be modern, and now we build with flat roofs, and now we get all these kind of problems. And you can multiply this 1,000,000 times for every country, what we lost when we abandoned traditional architecture.
Yeah.
I think this is really what you're saying is so powerful, because in some ways what you realize is that modernism and modern architecture, it really is an abstraction on human experience. Like it's a deep abstraction, whereas all of these solutions that our ancestors came up with, you could say that they're evolved with time. Like they're just iterations on iterations. You can't find the person responsible for them. They're almost organically adapted to the human body, but then, like you said, in some places actually organically, embedded in the landscape. They were developed by the peoples there to adjust to their lifestyle. And of course, it doesn't mean that we have to build like our ancestors, but to forget, like to just simply throw all of that almost like Darwinian work that was done, like to just throw it out and say, okay, now we're just going to create these abstract buildings, is crazy that we thought that was a good idea. Like the abstracted human, this international human that doesn't have their feet on the ground,
No
that
qualities, no culture, no nothing, no human expression. It's just a global consumer. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, and what's interesting is that it's even more diverse to think this way. It's to say, it's like, I love Chinese architecture. I think it's beautiful, but it would be weird if you just prop that down in Sweden or, in certain places. Like every place has its own beautiful things that they developed. And so we should be able to say, yeah, that's what we're going to do, because that's where we are and that's the tradition we have. We can also then appreciate Turkish or Syrian architecture, or all the different ones.
For people who have a normal love of their own culture, there's nothing more satisfying than seeing new art, new buildings being done that is in the tradition specific to their own nation. It's a tremendously satisfying thing to see when you see that. However, I'm afraid nowadays it's very fashionable to not have a love of your own culture. Among liberal Europeans, it's fashionable to despise your own country, to think that your own culture doesn't exist or is garbage.
Our elites, you must differ between the populace and our elites. Of course, the elites of Western Europe they are more loyal to each other than the country they represent. That's the horrible situation that Western Europe is in. That previously the Swedish elites were loyal to Sweden, the French elites were loyal to Sweden. Now they are loyal to each other and not the people that they represent. So yes, and they are very post-national and everything. And that's now we're going to politics, but I will keep it short. But that's the funny thing now that we need to, we need to put more expenses on our defense in Europe. But money is just one equation. If you for 50 years told us that nationalism is bad and white men are bad, who's going to defend the country? Who's going to volunteer to fight for Britain or Sweden or France when all these things that you want, you need young white men, I would say, in Western Europe, if you want a defense. And you have, you have bashed these people now for 50 years, so they are not, they are not raising their hands to defend the continent. Yeah, sorry, that was just
you need something in order to want to defend something. You have to be able to celebrate it. You can't defend your homeland, your traditions, your everything about it. If you're asked to despise it, then like you said, it means that ultimately we'll just be taken over by whatever. There's no inner glow. There's no inner light. And so but it's exciting to hear that there is a bit of this architectural uprising. In the United States, it's more complicated because it's younger, right? It's the same in Canada as well. One of the things for people who are listening or watching, you should see what Andrew has been doing. One of the great things that Andrew has been doing is really searching out local styles when he builds churches where he's going to build them, and then adapting, let's say, the traditional shape of an Orthodox church to a New England style building, or even to an Adobe style, kind of Mexican or Californian style. And so that's been a way in which to kind of give a sense to architects of what's possible. And the thing about your work, Andrew, that's amazing too, is that the buildings don't look, they're not nostalgic. And this is the problem with the classicism sometimes that you see, is that sometimes the classicism just looks like a copy of an old building, whereas what you're doing in some ways is extremely creative, because you're looking into the local styles and you're fusing it with the different purposes of the building. So there's a lot of possibility there.
Yeah, you're right. So I have a very interesting niche that I work in that Orthodox churches in America are not a very traditional typology. We don't have a lot of old ones here. So yeah, it's kind of a case-by-case invention. What should an Orthodox church look like in each region of America? And that's a way of making them fresh and new. But also, I in addition to that, I really do want my buildings to each look fresh and new. I don't want them to look like copies of old buildings. I think any good traditional architect does not want their buildings to look exactly like it's 1850 or exactly like it's 1750, because in doing that would not itself be traditional, because classical architecture looks a little bit different in every century through time. It always had a sort of fashionable evolution that made the people of any given decade feel like they were building something fresh and new. That was important to people then, and it's important to people now. So I would not say that my work is utterly uninfluenced by modernism. There are aspects of the sort of clean, crisp, sparsely ornamented modern aesthetic that I do imitate in my work, where I find it helpful, where I find it beneficial in the traditional mode in which I'm working at the time. So you'll notice that my buildings are not, dripping with ornament like an 18th century building. They do have a certain clear rationality, a certain sort of, predilection towards clear glass and bright, crisp light that, appeals to modern people who are used to modern buildings. So yeah, in their way, my buildings are of their time and appealing to the modern eyes of contemporary people, whilst also being completely rooted in millennia-old tradition of classical architecture.
Yeah, there is also in your work there is a kind of minimalist tradition of an emphasis on materiality, which I find in your work, where you have a kind of great joy in the materiality of the things you're presenting, because in some ways you're presenting them in a world of glass and gypsum and fake walls. There's a manner in which you're able to say, hey, this is a real thing, and kind of feature that as a part of it, because an ancient world, they wouldn't have had to think about that, right? It's like, well, this is a build of you in some ways are saying, I'm doing this on purpose and I'm featuring it as a part of the
and that partly comes from medieval architecture, which tended to show off stone as stone and timber as timber and so forth. But that's also a hallmark of good modern architecture. You know, the really good modern architects, the famous ones, they loved authentic materiality. You know, they loved showing off steel for what it was and bronze for what it was. And yeah, I was taught in my very modernistic architecture education to really, really emphasize authentic materiality. You don't see that much in run-of-the-mill modern building, because run-of-the-mill modern building is just cheap building. It's not really artistic design. But yeah, that is a certain place where you can find a sympathy between good modernism, medievalist church architecture, and Asian architecture, of course. You know, Japanese, Chinese traditional architecture has a very authentic expression of materiality.
Michael, you've been dying to say something. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
really. I just want to say, the difference between Andrews architecture and a firm like, Robert A.M. Stern, or most classical firms, I would say, is that Andrew create buildings with a soul. You really see that there has been a craftsman's hand on that building. It's so, you feel it when you see them. That's different. If you look at a building by Robert I.M. Stern, the big firm, or any of the most European classical architects, it's a shape. They have a classical shape, but there is you don't feel that there has been a craftsman's hand, and touched it, and and live in the building. So they are beautiful buildings, but they are a bit soulless. So when I see, of course, I have not had the privilege to visit your buildings physically, but I only see them on all the photos that you publish on the internet.
It's much better when you're there, by the way.
Yeah,
Michael.
yeah,
They're really amazing.
Yeah, they are amazing because they have, even if you think that they don't have that much ornament, they have much more ornament than most new classical buildings. And they have this small deal that this. I think of a townhouse that you build on Cannon Street in Charleston, and you have these small wooden cannons, that like columns that lift at the balcony. These things, make all the difference. This enlivens a building with soul, and I've seen small ornamental details on almost all your buildings that you do, and of course the interiors are amazing. All the craftsmanship. That is the difference between your architecture and 95% of all classical architecture. And that's a problem that we have in general in contemporary classical architecture, and that we discuss a lot, that they make the shapes, but they are too afraid, or maybe they lack the artistic skills to create meaningful ornament and, craftsmanship details. Like
in a sense,
a work of love. A work of love, not just a real estate.
Because architecture is a place to be. It has this. It is a participative space. It's not. It's not just a place to put things in. And so, when you sense the participation of the person that made the building, it increases also that sense in you. That the sense that you are inhabiting a purposeful place, right? Not just a building that could, not just a space. It could be anything that you could be kind of move from one thing to the next.
Yeah, well, the whole way modern architecture works as a business practice, it's extremely divorced from the construction site and from craftsmanship. Architecture offices produce a set of drawings, it goes out the door. Somebody else who has no artistic sense at all typically interprets the drawings and builds the building. And their goal typically is to make the building as flawless as possible, in the sense of making plastered and stuccoed surfaces as perfectly flat, corners as perfectly crisp. So the few contemporary architects whose buildings do seem to have that human touch, they tend to be the sort of artisanal designer builders who are in charge of their own construction sites and really, hire their own guys and pick up the trowel and show them what to do. And I do a fair amount of that myself. Most of my buildings are built close at hand, and I'll go on the site and I'll just grab a paintbrush or grab a trowel from the workman and show him how I want it. I also am experienced at building things myself, so I know how to do that. I know how to make most anything on my own building. Interestingly, America's, best architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, who falls in this interesting place sort of in between traditional and modern, his buildings have a tremendous amount of human touch soul to them when you visit them in person. They're very small scaled, very handmade. I mean, every little detail on them just seems like beautiful little handmade, hand polished thing. And he was very much on his construction sites, very, very particular with showing people how to build every little thing.
Mm. Well, one of the problems is also the people that have the money don't necessarily have that attention as well. Like they wouldn't maybe not have the capacity or the desire to see that, because they're basically making something to sell most of the time anyways.
Well, a lot of Americans with money have that sort of, you know, what I would call in a derogatory sense a bourgeois or new money taste, where they want the look of things that are traditional as a branding thing, as a sort of virtue signaling, something to Instagram, as it were. But they don't actually really like old stuff or old buildings. Like a lot of the people who commission the classical McMansion, you take them to an actual historic building and they think, ooh, it's dirty, there's mildew on it, the plaster is cracked, it doesn't have a giant luxurious closet for me to, put my shoe collection in. I couldn't live in this. They actually, at heart, they're really modernists who want a very modern building that's entirely designed around modern conveniences. They just want it to have a look that is reminiscent of the aristocracy of old, so it looks good on Instagram.
It's worse. It's equally bad in Europe.
Yeah.
Everyone is new. How to say that? There are many, upcoming people that have become middle class the last 50 years, and they are so afraid to be labeled having bad taste. So they open a magazine, and they feel, oh, I should like this today. Okay, I like this today. I should drink this wine today. Okay, I drink this wine today. There's no individuality at all. It's just, the magazine tells them what they should like and what is considered good taste, and then they will follow that slavishly.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I'm curious what you think, because this is something I've seen here and it just drives me crazy, is in some ways architectural fashion shifts, where all of a sudden we have had this, I think it was about 20 years ago, we had this crazy shift, which went from a weird kind of neoclassical, not like almost kind of like castle looking houses where they had a lot of fancy stuff. And now it's every single house has the same design here, all through the province. It's like black with like maybe some gray stone and maybe brown with like black windows, and that's it. And they're like kind of new modern, like kind of low grade modernist style with the kind of flat roofs maybe, or very little roof. And everywhere, all of a sudden, it's just like, and these houses just take over. Every single development has the same style everywhere. And I'm thinking,
that is actually what I described. It's people are afraid of
these houses. They're going to hate them. They're going to think, oh, these are the houses my parents, because it's just this horrible fashion that goes through the population.
Because people are afraid.
How to deal with that.
No, it's because people are afraid, because the lifestyle magazine told them that this is what they should like. And if you are, being middle class or upper middle class or striving, it's not about the money. It's about, the culture. So you don't dare to trust your own eyes. You don't dare to trust your own taste. If the magazine tells you that this is what you should have, you buy that, because we communicate in that way. So then other people will recognize that here lives a sophisticated upper middle class person because he lives in a black box. So even if they don't like it, they like what it communicates to other people that have read the same magazine and then understands, this must be a sophisticated middle class person that lives in this building because it's a black building. So we are a social creature. Unfortunately, we are a social creature, and that makes us do bad choices because we want to be like everyone else.
And it's weird because we had to remake our house about 5 years ago because our house was flooded, and everybody's doing one thing here. We actually had to bend the rules of the city in order to be able to rebuild the house the way we wanted to. And Andrew helped us a little. He designed the facade and kind of helped us to get the proportions right and everything. And it's a very simple, like, wooden house, with a very kind of symmetrical windows and a nice like porch and everybody stops in front of our house. There's nothing special about it. It's just has a normal human proportions. Like it just looks like a normal house, the way houses should look. And then everybody stops in front of our house and everybody's surprised to see that. And it's just so funny. And it's always, but it's a little bit of a sore thumb because it sticks out of all of these brown, like weird houses that are being built.
Well, sort of fashionable house building has always been with us. If you consider, walking around London, every Georgian, block of townhouses in London, they all look much the same. Yeah, I don't necessarily think having a sort of a strong fashion of the decade is always bad in architecture. It's just a question of, is there quality there? It's like, did the trendsetters who promoted that fashion, and do the architects and builders who materialize that fashion, are they up to the task, and are they doing good work? In nowadays, they're not, just because the entire culture of architecture and building is pretty bad right now. And of course, that's not true of all the arts. Obviously, there's other areas in which contemporary art, has much better talent. Movie making, for instance. But it just so happens that there's a talent. There's a talent.
That's
What's
over. The movie making thing
that
is
might be. That might be true. That might be true. Maybe. Well, where do you think the talented artists are going then? I mean, where are they going to find their home?
Yeah, exactly. They're all terrified of AI is what's going on. But I mean, I think the idea of people moving into architecture and to thinking about the environment, if we want the change to be deep, that's where it has to happen first. Because I've said this several times, but city planning and architecture is the most important art. I'm not an architect, but I can see that because it fades behind people's perception. It's actually, it pre-models the way that people understand who they are, what's their relationship to each other, what's inside, what's outside, what is above, what is below. Just basic orientation in your life is based on city planning and an architecture. And there's a deep alienation in modern living that comes from living in these horrible places and these abstracted spaces with no center and no community and no sense of relationship. And so to me, that's a call for people to take it seriously, for people who are studying architecture, that you're doing the most important thing. It's hard right now. It's hard to do it, but that is the most important thing to be done.
It's interesting. The people who design movie sets and the Disney Imagineers who design the theme park stuff, those are people who have very good architectural skills and who would have become traditional architects if they lived in the 19th century, but they went into the sort of virtual reality of movies and theme parks because it was an outlet where they can really do artistic work in a traditional style. But maybe what you're describing is that we're going to see that invert, that people are going to start saying, I'm through with working for Disney. I can't really put my talents to good use. There's too much bureaucratic and political crap. I'm going to go back to the real world and where I can do real art there.
Yeah, we will see that planned city that they have at Disney. Supposedly it's not bad. Like I've seen a little bit of it.
Having spent almost my whole life vowing that I'm never going to Disney World, I actually did end up going to Disney World because my children forced me. And I have to say the Victorian style architecture at the Magic Kingdom is really good. It's really, really good. The detailing is totally correct. The materiality is authentic. I was amazed. I'm never going to let anybody get away with the phrase like the Disney effect or that's Disney World architecture, meaning it's fakey. I'm going to see because the actual Disney World architecture is actually really good.
So as Disney collapses, all you Disney architects go back into the world and make beautiful things for real people.
I must also add, it's the film industry that saved classical music also, because if you want to hear good contemporary classical music, that's from movies. The jingle of Indiana Jones, Star Wars, all that is classical music. No one listens to contemporary classical music because it's just bad noise. But in the movie industry, you really got some very good new classical masterpieces. So I just wanted to.
All right, so I think we're going to wrap up, but I would say, Michael and Andrew, to all the people listening, Michael, you describe yourself as an activist, so I would say, what's your pitch? What do you want people to do? Like, what would you like people that are watching to do?
Well, okay, self-promotion is never beautiful, but for people that are interested, I can. There are 2 web pages that one can use. I created them both. If you go to www.newchat.org, there you find a directory of classical architecture schools, of classical architecture firms divided by country, and also you find an atlas. It's a Google Map layers, the atlas of new traditional architecture. We can find a lot of Andrew's work there. It's a complete Google atlas, and you can find thousands of beautiful new classical projects, and you can go on a discovery over the world and see what's happening, in different countries. And through this web page, you can also connect to the different social media pages, and then you just can connect with like-minded. Because the most important thing is for you as a non-architect to just know that beauty and ugliness is a choice. There are no rational reasons for all the ugliness. It's a choice. We can choose beauty if we want to. That's...
How about you, Andrew?
Well, yeah, I would say, if you're a young person who has an interest in going into artistic architecture, consider going to school for it. There are some classical schools in America now that train classical architects. Well, and you might even be able to partner with a licensed architect, the way I often do, so that you can do projects without having to go through all of the sort of bureaucratic hell of getting licensed and so forth. There are definitely partnership arrangements that allow people to concentrate on the art side of architecture. And if you're a patron, if you're somebody with money, and you want to do something about the ugliness of the world, you can, become a developer. Find a talented designer who can do beautiful buildings, and think up a project that you could do. Not one in a gated community that no one will ever see, but one that's like, in a town, find a beautiful old town that's got like an empty corner lot, and build the best building in that town on that lot, and put the place on the map. Find a little project with a big impact that'll really make thousands of people wake up and say, wow, we can build beautiful things again.
That's great. That's a great call, especially the one about, because I know a lot of very wealthy people are building these houses for themselves, like you said, and behind gates and everything, and that's fine. Obviously, if I had the money, that's what I would do for myself too. But doing it out in the community and waking people up to the effect that beauty has on our perception of ourselves, of our space, and the people around us, I think that's a wonderful call. So, Andrew, thank you for what you're doing. Michael as well. I think this is great, important work. And so everybody, I will put a bunch of links also to Michael's social media, to the website he mentioned, to Andrew as well. And so you can check it out and follow through. So thanks everyone for your attention. Thanks both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.